This is a tutorial on how to use the S-Tec System 55 Autopilot as found in the default Cessna 172 of X-Plane 1130. This tutorial only deals with the analog version of the Cessna 172 and the S-Tec Autopilot. Keep in mind it behaves very differently from the GFC 700 Autopilot you find in the G1000 Cessna 172 with the Garmin G1000 digital flight deck. For using the autopilot on the G1000 Cessna, please refer to the G1000 manual that is supplied with X-Plane. So, for the remainder of the video, we will only be concerned with the S-Tec autopilot in the analog steam gauge non-G1000 Cessna 172. In this aircraft, you find the S-Tec autopilot system at the bottom of the avionics stack. Before we use it, let's go briefly over the joystick configuration. There's two settings I recommend you make to get the most realistic experience. And those two settings you should do is assign a button to the autopilot disconnect switch and a button to the control wheel steering switch. These two controls are found on the yoke of a real airplane as well, readily accessible to the pilot so that the pilot can actuate those two buttons without ever letting go of his yoke. So you should probably do the same with your joystick or flight yoke as well. Let's look at those two functions. The first is the autopilot disconnect function, which is called disconnect servos whichever side is active. So you find it in the autopilot commands under autopilot, and then it lists the various disconnect commands you have. And the correct one that you want to assign to your joystick is disconnect servos whichever side is active, because that will work with whatever plane you fly, whether it's the 172 or the 737, it will always do the right thing. So this is the one that you should have readily accessible on your joystick, and in my case I have assigned it to button 0. So the second one, very easy, control wheel steering mode, just call it that, so very easy to find with the search box, control wheel steering mode, and I have assigned it to button 3 of my joystick. So now that this setup is complete, the buttons on my joystick are exactly configured as the yoke on the real plane. Before we use the autopilot in flight, we want to conduct some pre-flight checks. So for the pre-flight check, first make sure that the autopilot has passed its self-test and is showing the ready light. If it detects a failure, like a failure of the autopilot computer itself, or a failure of the turn coordinator gyro, this is what supplies the turn and bank information to the autopilot. So if any failure existed there would not be a ready light here, and instead about here it would say fail. So we make sure it doesn't do that before we want to use the autopilot. Then for a simple ground test, what we want to do is we press the heading button, get the autopilot in heading mode, and just turn the heading bug on the directional gyro to make sure that the aileron servo responds correctly. And while we're doing this, we want to grab our joystick and make sure we can easily oversteer the aileron servo in case we have to by, well, exerting a force on our joystick. And then we also want to make sure that when we press the disconnect button, the warning sound is heard, the autopilot disconnects, it reverts back to ready, and most importantly, the yoke is now completely free. We don't have to fight the autopilot. It responds to our joystick moves without any interference. The next pre-flight test we want to do is we put the autopilot in heading mode again, and then we press the vertical speed button. The vertical speed out should be pretty close to 0, and you can see the trim is working. It's trimming down. The trim actuator is working. We twist the vertical speed button to ensure we get the appropriate response of either trim up or trim down. And then we want to make sure when we activate the elevator trim manually, so when we press the trim rocker on our joystick or yoke, we get the disconnect sound and the autopilot immediately disconnects, as it should. That completes the pre-flight tests. Now let's look at how to use the autopilot in flight. And for that, I'm going to put the The most straightforward mode to use in flight is probably the heading mode. Simply press the heading button and then the autopilot will do whatever is necessary to achieve a magnetic heading that you set with the orange bug on your directional gyro. Note that when you just activate heading mode, no vertical mode will be active, which means the elevator servo will not be clutched and you can use your elevator freely, and also the trim axis. If you have a hardware trim wheel or any other kind of hardware control assigned to the trim axis, you can move that and not interfere with the autopilot. To activate a vertical mode on the autopilot, you can, for example, press vertical speed. It will then lock in to the vertical speed that existed at the time you pressed the button, and it'll display it in multiples of 100 feet on the display. So right now it has set a descent of 300 feet per minute. You can use the little rotary to adjust the descent or climb rate. For example, in this case, 700 feet per minute. Do keep in mind though that the autopilot is pretty dumb. So when you set, for example, a climb of 1,000 feet per minute, the autopilot will pitch whatever it thinks it's necessary to achieve 1,000 foot per minute climb, and it has no idea whether you actually have enough power to sustain that climb. So in this case, we have set it up for 1,000 foot per minute climb, and it'll quickly run out of airspeed, and the autopilot will keep pitching up in order to achieve the vertical speed, and it will actually stall the airplane if we are not careful, because it has no idea what our speed is. So that's something to keep in mind. Be very, very careful with the vertical speed mode in a climb, because when you're not paying attention, the autopilot might be stalling your plane. Alright, I have now pressed the altitude hold button instead, and of course that function is also pretty straightforward. It will keep whatever altitude you had at the time you pressed the button. For fine adjustments to the altitude, you can use the vertical speed rotary, which in the altitude mode will adjust the altitude reference in steps of 20 feet. So right now we're about 20 feet above 3,000, so we can give it one click with the vertical speed knob that adjusts the altitude reference by 20 feet down. Note that the autopilot gets its altitude information from a separate static system and is not affected by your altimeter setting. So if you change your altimeter setting, note that it doesn't affect the autopilot. Also, a failure of the primary static port, which is on the left side on the front of the aircraft, will affect your altimeter, but will not affect your autopilot, because the autopilot gets its static reference information from two static ports in the back of the plane. Another very helpful mode is control wheel steering. Remember the button we assigned on the joystick to control wheel steering? Well, now is the time to press it. While we press and hold down the button, we observe that on the autopilot display, the heading mode and altitude hold disappeared, and instead a little readout is there that says CWS, or control wheel steering, and the vertical speed indicator is once more active, and it'll mirror the vertical speed that we're currently holding. So for example, if I put the plane in level flight in a 500 foot per minute climb and then let go of the button, as soon as I let go of the button, the autopilot will lock in to the attitude that I have and keep the climb rate that I had when I let go of the button. And that also works in the lateral axis as well. So if I establish a standard rate turn to the left, for example, and then the vertical speed that I want, and then let go of the button, the autopilot will do whatever is necessary to maintain this turn rate. control wheel steering comes especially in handy if you want to level off at an altitude, because this autopilot in this plane has no pre-selector. The best way to level off at an altitude is by using control wheel steering for a smooth level off, and then press altitude hold. Alright, let's look at the lateral navigation modes that we have. We can, for example, track a VOR radial. In order to do that, I've tuned a VOR on my primary nav radio, which in this airplane is the GNS 530, and I can now dial in a radial that I want to fly to the VOR. So let's see, about 10 looks nice. Why not? Yep, let's put it on 10 degrees. So remember that the autopilot is not connected to the OBS ring of this instrument. So in order to transfer the bearing information that we want to fly a 010 radial, I need to dial the radial into the heading bug. Now, I press the nav button. The autopilot goes into nav mode, and because the needle is pegged, it will now establish a 45 degrees intercept to the selected radial. And keep in mind, it only knows about the selected radial because I've dialed it in with the orange heading bug. If you're flying a plane that has a horizontal situation indicator instead, using the heading bug will not be necessary. In planes with horizontal situation indicators, the autopilot will get the front course information from the yellow arrow, the front course pointer, on the horizontal situation indicator. As we are now on a 45 degree intercept to fly a heading of 010 inbound to the VOR, we should pretty soon observe the needle to start moving, and as soon as it does that, the autopilot will intercept the radial for tracking towards the station. I can speed this up a little bit. There we go. And as you can see, as the needle swings in, the autopilot will reduce the intercept angle and then hopefully smoothly track a 010 course. Of course, right now we are very close to the VOR, so might get a little squiggly here. Because we're only 5.1 miles away from the VOR. Alright, so now the autopilot establishes the 010 inbound course to the VOR, which is just at the airport here in front of our nose. Alright, now let's assume we are not happy with the 45 degree intercept angle that the autopilot normally uses. In this case, we can do what is known as a pilot-controlled intercept or a dual-mode intercept. To do that, we press the heading mode so that the autopilot simply follows the heading bug. And then we set whatever radial we want to intercept, let's say the 45 radial. And now we can set a more aggressive we can fly a more aggressive intercept using the heading bug, selecting whatever heading we think is necessary. And when the autopilot is flying this heading, we can press the nav mode. And now, as you can see, the heading mode has not turned off. Instead, the heading mode will stay active as long as it takes for this needle to move. And as you can see right now, I'm doing something you should probably not be doing. I'm flying a close to 90 degree intercept, which will probably throw the autopilot off a bit. But in order to demonstrate what pilot selected intercept is, it is you select the heading yourself, you are in heading mode, and then you arm the nav mode on top of heading mode, where it'll stay like kind of watching the needle, and then it'll turn off the heading mode. And then it is very, very important to actually dial in the front course again with the heading bug as soon as the heading mode goes off. Again, if you're flying a plane with a horizontal situation indicator, this is not necessary. But in case of the 172, you absolutely need to set the heading bug appropriately. The next thing I want to look at is GPS navigation. Assume you're using your GPS to fly a flight plan that may contain multiple points. In our case, I just want to set up a direct to some nearby airport, say Harnett County. And now the GPS gives a course information, and if I press the CDI button for the GPS to supply this course information, we now have it on the CDI instrument. Now we know that our desired track is going to 168, so we're just going to use the heading bug, put it to 168 just about, and then activate nav mode. And now nav mode is active, coupled onto the GPS because we selected that for the CDI, and to the heading bug, which is of course not very comfortable, because over the course of your flight plan your desired track will of course change as you fly through the points of your flight plan. So the S-Tec System 55 has another mode that is very helpful for navigating with the GPS, and it's called GPS steering, where it will no longer require you to set the heading bug because it will get this information directly from the GPS. To go into GPS steering mode, what you need to do is you need to press nav a second time. So if you're in nav mode and you press nav again, you will notice on the display that a little indication called GPSS, GPS steering, appears. And once it does, the autopilot will follow the GPS flight plan through all turns and twists that you programmed into the GPS, while completely ignoring your heading button. As you can see, the autopilot now intercepts our GPS flight plan to the Harnett County Airport. In order to fly an ILS approach with the autopilot, we need to have an ILS localizer and glide slope tuned on the nav1 radio, and then what we can do is we can press the approach button and, very importantly, set the ILS front course, the localizer front course, on our orange heading bug. The autopilot will then maneuver as necessary to intercept the localizer and track it on the front course. Note that this does not necessarily arm glide slope capture as well. As you can see right here, there is no indication besides altitude indicating that the autopilot would be waiting for a glide slope. For a glide slope arm to occur with the approach mode, you must be within half of the maximum deflection on the localizer and at least 60% deflection under the glide slope at the time you press the approach button. As we pressed the approach button first, we were too far away from the localizer still. Now that we have intercepted the localizer, we can force the autopilot to re-evaluate the conditions for glide slope capture. We do this by pressing the altitude button. As you can see, pressing the altitude button with all the necessary preconditions for glide slope arming met, that is, we are under the glide slope to intercept it from below, and we are within a maximum of half deflection on the localizer, the autopilot has now decided it is safe to arm glide slope capture and indicates so. Now you can observe as the glide slope moves in the autopilot will click out of altitude hold mode and track the glide slope all the way down. We can at this point even force the autopilot to go into glide slope tracking prematurely by pressing the altitude hold button again. But as you can see here, the autopilot automatically tracks the glide slope once it intercepts it. So, to recapitulate, pressing the approach button will select approach sensitivity on the nav mode, but it will only arm the glide slope when you're in altitude hold mode, under the glide slope, and relatively close to the localizer. If you find your glide slope is not arming when you want it to, you are probably either too far away from the localizer or not far under or far enough under the glide slope. You need at least a 60% deflection of the glide slope needle upwards in order for glide slope to arm. For flying the GPS approach, you will normally be in GPS steering mode for the transition. That has the advantage of you not having to readjust the heading bug for every turn that the transition to the GPS approach requires. So during the transition, you will normally have pressed nav twice, observe the GPS as indication, and the autopilot will fly the transition to the GPS approach automatically. Note that, however, to transition into approach mode onto the on the GPS approach, so that you can track a virtual glide path, for example that of an LPV approach, you will need to transition out of GPS steering mode and into approach mode, and that in turn will require you to set the front course, in this case of the LPV approach, with the heading bug. So in preparation for doing that, we want to select the final approach course of our GPS approach with the heading bug. Note right now that nothing happens because we are still in GPS steering mode, and that will help us with the turn anticipation so that the autopilot will fly this turn here relatively smoothly. As you can see, the turn countdown is enunciated on the GPS, and the autopilot will act accordingly. Notice now that we have the LPV indication of the GPS, is a good time to transition into approach mode. Keep in mind though that the same rules for glide slope arming also apply to glide path arming, so we probably want to wait until the needle is pretty much centered. At this point, we can press the approach button, transition out of GPS steering into nav approach mode, and as you can see, because we are under the virtual glide path, we were reasonably close to the center, and we were in altitude hold. Also the glide slope mode has armed, which will track the LPV glide path of the GPS approach. Note that this required us to set the final approach course with the heading bug. This will not be necessary on aircraft that have a horizontal situation indicator. This is unique to aircraft that have a directional gyro.